The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Letitia Bell read it 3 times before she let it fall from her fingers into the dust at her feet. It was not the words themselves that broke something open inside her chest. It was the handwriting, her mother's careful, slanted script, the same loops and curls she had practiced for years at the finishing school in Philadelphia, the same pen strokes that had signed letters of invitation, letters of introduction, letters that opened doors into parlors and drawing rooms and lives that smelled of lavender and money. The words said what Letitia had always known they would eventually say, because her mother was nothing if not persistent, and persistence dressed in silk was still a trap. Come home. Bernard is still willing. He has waited long enough, and so have we. She stood in the middle of the main street of Rock, New Mexico Territory, in the summer of 1883, the sun hammering down on the back of her neck, her boots coated in red dust that no amount of shaking ever fully removed, and she felt the pull of that letter like a rope around her ribs, tightening. Bad news. The voice came from behind her, low and unhurried, and Letitia did not startle because she had learned in 14 months of living in Rock that a woman who startled easily did not last. She turned slowly, tucking the letter into the pocket of her canvas work apron, and looked at the man standing a few feet away in the partial shade of the mercantile's porch overhang. Martin Dalton was watching her with the particular kind of attention that made her feel both seen and evaluated, as though he were trying to determine the structural integrity of something he was considering trusting with serious weight. He was 31 years old and lean in the way that men who worked outdoors became lean, not from deprivation but from constant motion. His jaw carried 3 days of dark stubble, and his eyes were the color of creek water in shadow, not quite green, not quite gray. Something in between that shifted depending on the light. He held his hat in his hand, which meant he had just come from the post office as well, because Martin Dalton did not otherwise remove his hat on Main Street. She had noticed that about him. She had noticed more about him than she intended to. "Nothing I cannot manage," she said. "I didn't ask if you could manage it." He stepped off the porch and the full sun caught his face, and something in his expression shifted into something she could not name. "I asked if it was bad news. The distinction matters to you. Most distinctions matter to me." He glanced at the pocket where she had tucked the letter, then back to her face, and she felt suddenly that the letter was visible through the canvas, that the words were somehow legible from where he stood. "You turned pale when you read it. I was across the street." Letitia pressed her lips together. "My mother writes to inform me that a man named Bernard Ashworth is still willing to marry me. He has been willing for approximately 3 years. Apparently his patience is finally reaching its limits, and so is hers." Martin said nothing for a moment. A wagon rolled past them on the street, raising a brief curtain of dust, and a dog sleeping on the steps of the barber shop opened one eye and closed it again. The whole world felt suspended. "Bernard Ashworth," Martin repeated slowly. "Philadelphia money, Boston actually, but the species is the same." She looked at him directly now, because she was not a woman who looked away when things became uncomfortable, and because something about the way he was listening made her want to keep talking, which was itself an uncomfortable sensation. "His family owns 3 shipping firms and a textile operation. His house has 14 rooms and a staff of 6. My mother has been corresponding with his mother since I was 20 years old. It has all been very carefully arranged. And you left Philadelphia and came here instead." "I came to New Mexico Territory instead, yes." Martin was quiet again, and in that quiet something shifted between them, some weight of understanding passing between two people who did not yet fully understand each other. He turned his hat over in his hands, a gesture she had come to associate with him when he was thinking through something he was not yet ready to say. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," she said. "Why did you do it? Leave all that behind, come here of all places." He gestured vaguely at the street, at Redrock's crooked buildings and cracked facades and the distant red rock formations rising out of the scrubland like the ruins of something ancient and enormous. You had comfort. You had a future already built for you, and you chose this. Letitia looked at him for a long moment. The sun was relentless. Somewhere down the street, two men were arguing about the price of cattle, and neither of them was listening to the other. A hawk circled overhead, riding a thermal, apparently in no hurry about anything at all. "I would rather show you than tell you," she said. "If you want to understand it." Something in his eyes changed. Not softened exactly. Martin Dalton's eyes did not soften easily. She had gathered that much, but opened slightly, like a door given a careful push. "All right," he said. "Show me." She had not expected him to agree. She was not entirely certain what she had expected, but agreement had not been at the top of her list. That was how it started. To understand how they came to be standing on that main street on that Tuesday in July of 1883, it is necessary to go back 14 months. To the morning Letitia Bell stepped off the southbound stage from Santa Fe and set her boot down on Redrock soil for the first time, carrying one trunk, a satchel of tools, and a letter of introduction from a mining surveyor named Caldwell who owed her a professional favor. She was 26 years old. She had a degree in geology from a college in Philadelphia that did not technically award degrees to women, but which had allowed her to audit every course in the department for 4 years, and had ultimately, under pressure from a sympathetic professor named Whitmore, issued her a certificate of completion that was functionally equivalent to the degree they would not name as such. She had spent 2 years after that working as an unpaid researcher for Professor Whitmore's geological survey of the Appalachian region, recording data, drafting maps, writing analysis that ended up published under his name with a small acknowledgement buried in the footnotes. She had done all of this while living in her parents' house in Philadelphia, while attending dinners where Bernard Ashworth sat across from her and spoke about the promising future of American maritime trade, while wearing dresses her mother selected and smiling in the way her mother had taught her to smile, which was warmly but not too openly, because too much warmth read as desperation. The hidden truth of Letitia Bell, the secret that she had kept pressed flat inside herself like a flower between the pages of a book, was that she did not want any of it. Not the 14-room house. Not the staff of 6. Not Bernard Ashworth, who was perfectly pleasant and profoundly uninteresting, who looked at her the way a man looked at a well-crafted piece of furniture, appreciative of the quality, certain of its function, never remotely curious about what it might want. What Letitia wanted was the earth. She wanted to crack it open and read its secrets. She wanted to stand on the lip of a canyon and understand the millions of years of pressure and shift and upheaval that had written the story in the stone walls. She wanted to map things that had not been mapped, to understand formations that had not yet been named, to do work that was genuinely her own work, with her name on it, for the first time in her life. New Mexico territory was, according to everything she had read and every geologist she had managed to speak with, one of the most extraordinary and least studied geological regions on the continent. The red rock country around the Rio Grande was a living record of volcanic activity, of ancient seabeds and tectonic drama on a scale that made the Appalachians look like a gentle afternoon. There was a mining operation outside of Redrock that needed a surveyor and could not afford to pay for a qualified one from back east. Caldwell's letter said she was qualified. It did not mention that she was a woman. The man running the Redrock mine was called Hector Price, and when Letitia walked through his office door with her letter and her tool satchel, his expression went through approximately 4 distinct phases of shock before settling into something guarded and skeptical. He was a practical man, Hector Price, which meant he was ultimately more interested in results than in principles. And when Letitia spent the first afternoon walking the mine site and produced, by the following morning, a preliminary survey analysis that was more detailed and accurate than anything his previous surveyor had managed in a month, He decided that perhaps the world was occasionally surprising, and that he could work with surprising. She was paid $40 a month, which was less than a male surveyor would have been paid and more than no money at all, which was what she had been earning in Professor Whitmore's footnotes. She found a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Alma Reese, who was small and sharp-eyed, and who had survived enough of life's harder passages to be beyond the stage of being impressed by anyone's expectations. Alma did not care that Letitia came home from the mine site with red dust in her hair and calluses forming on her hands. She cared that the rent was paid on the first of the month, and that no one left mud on the clean floors. Raydrock was a town of approximately 300 people, and like most towns of approximately 300 people in the New Mexico Territory in 1883, it existed in a state of ongoing negotiation between ambition and survival. There were cattle ranchers who ran operations on the surrounding land. There were miners working several different operations in the hills. There was a small community of Hispanic families who had been on this land for generations before any of the Anglo newcomers arrived, and whose relationship with those newcomers ranged from cautious cooperation to outright friction depending on the day and the individual involved. There was a church, a school taught by a young woman named Clara Marsh, who had come from Ohio and who was trying very hard to convince herself she did not regret that decision, and a sheriff named Aldous Bayard who was competent and fair in the particular limited way of men, who understood that their job was largely to manage the consequences of other people's bad decisions. Martin Dalton had arrived in Raydrock 5 years before Letitia, which meant he was in the comfortable position of being considered by the local population as someone who belonged there, which was a status that took approximately 3 years to accumulate and was awarded silently and without ceremony. He ran cattle on a piece of land south of town that he had purchased outright from a rancher who had gone broke in the drought of 1877 and needed to leave. The land was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was dry and rocky, and the grass it supported was the tough, sparse kind that grew close to the earth and did not wave romantically in the breeze. But it was functional, and Martin had a talent for functioning in environments that did not offer much room for error. He had come from Texas originally, from a family that had run cattle there for 2 generations, and he had learned ranching the way people learned things when learning them was the same as staying alive. He had also learned, somewhere along the way, the particular skill of not asking for more than a situation could reasonably provide. This was both his greatest strength and, in ways he had not yet fully examined, his most significant limitation. The first time Letitia and Martin had a real conversation rather than the polite exchanges of people who simply lived in the same small town. She was sitting on a rock formation about 2 miles outside of town at an hour that was technically still morning, but was already ferociously hot, sketching a cross-section diagram of a sedimentary layer she had been tracking across 3 different survey sites. She was so absorbed in the work that she did not hear his horse until he was about 30 feet away, and then she heard it and did not look up because she was in the middle of a measurement. He waited. She finished the measurement and wrote it in her notebook and then looked up. "I'm not lost," she said immediately. He looked mildly surprised. "I didn't think you were. Most people who come up behind me when I'm working assume I've wandered out here by accident. Most people might not know you work out here." He glanced at her notebook, at the careful diagrams visible from where he sat on his horse, and something curious crossed his face. "What are you drawing?" She had explained it to him then, in the direct and unself-conscious way that she explained things to people who seemed genuinely interested, without the apologetic softening she had spent years learning to apply in parlors back east, where genuine interest in geology from a woman was considered eccentric at best and off-putting at worst. She had explained about the sedimentary layers and what they indicated about the history of the region, about the mineral deposits the mine was chasing, and why she believed they were looking in approximately the right place, but not the precisely right place. She had talked for probably 8 minutes before she registered that she had been talking for 8 minutes and stopped herself. "I'm sorry," she said. "I tend to over-explain." "You tend to explain accurately," he said. "There's a difference." He looked out at the rock formations around them, and she watched his face while he looked, and she saw something in it that she recognized because she felt it herself, a kind of respectful attention to the landscape, a willingness to take it seriously. "I've been riding this country for 5 years, and I never knew any of that about these rocks. Most people don't. It's not the kind of thing that comes up in conversation. Maybe it should." He looked back at her, and there was something in the directness of his gaze that was different from the way most men looked at her, which was either with the cataloging interest of someone assessing a potential acquisition, or with the slightly condescending goodwill of someone trying not to show they found her unconventional. Martin Dalton looked at her the way she looked at the rocks, as though there were things there that he did not yet understand, and that the not understanding was interesting rather than frustrating. "Martin Dalton," he said, "South Pasture Ranch 2 miles that direction. Letitia Bell, mine survey 2 miles this direction." They had looked at each other for a moment in the heavy desert heat, with the hawk above them and the silence around them, and then he had tipped his hat and ridden on, and she had gone back to her diagram, and for the rest of that afternoon she had been slightly more aware of the direction he had gone than she would have expected. Over the following months, they had developed the kind of friendship that grew slowly in arid conditions, the way certain desert plants grew, not dramatically, not in any display that drew attention to itself, but with a deep rootedness that came from finding what little water there was and not letting go of it. They talked when they encountered each other in town. He had once ridden out to a section of his land where he thought something unusual was happening in a dry creek bed, and brought her to see it, and she had identified the formation for him, and they had spent 2 hours sitting on opposite sides of the creek talking about it, and about completely unrelated things simultaneously. The conversation jumping between geology and cattle management, and the peculiarities of Reed Rock's social ecosystem, with a naturalness that surprised them both. She had not told him about Bernard Ashworth. She had not told anyone in Reed Rock about the life she had left behind in Philadelphia, about the 14 rooms and the careful arrangements, and the years of being someone's beautifully appointed future. It was not a secret she was consciously keeping, exactly. It was more that the two versions of herself existed in such different atmospheres that bringing them into contact felt unnecessary, like carrying a lamp into a room that already had the sun coming through the windows. And then her mother's letter arrived, and Martin Dalton had been across the street, and she had turned pale without knowing it, and he had asked, and she had said she would show him. What she showed him was her work. She started the next morning, arriving at his ranch at sunup, which was her usual working hour, and which she chose because it was the coolest part of the desert day, and because she liked the quality of the light at that hour. It came in at an angle that showed the texture of the rock faces in high relief, made the geological story easier to read. He was already awake, which she had expected. Ranchers were not late sleepers. "I want to show you what I've been building," she said, before he could offer her coffee, though she wanted the coffee. "Come with me." She took him to the survey tent she had established at the mine site, which Hector Price had given her permission to use on her off days for her own research, because Hector Price had developed over 14 months a somewhat inconvenient respect for Letitia's judgment that occasionally overrode his initial instincts. The tent was larger than it looked from outside, because she had organized it with the efficient compression of someone who had learned to create functional space from limited resources. The walls were hung with maps she had drafted herself, not the rough sketched maps that most surveyors in this territory produced, but precise, detailed topographical records that showed the elevation changes, the formation types, the known mineral deposits, the areas of unexplored potential. There were notebooks stacked in a wooden crate she had built from salvaged lumber, filled with her observations and measurements and analysis going back to her first day in Reed Rock. There were rock samples arranged along a makeshift shelf, each one labeled in her precise handwriting with the location, the depth, the formation type, the mineral composition as best as she could identify it with her tools. Martin stood in the middle of all of it and turned slowly, taking it in. "How much of this is yours?" he asked. "I mean, how much of this did you produce yourself?" "All of it," she said. "The mine survey is separate, that belongs to Hector's operation. This is my own research. I've been building a comprehensive geological record of this region. Every canyon, every formation, every deposit I can access. I want to publish it." He looked at her. "Publish." "A geological survey of the New Mexico Territory's Central Red Rock region. There's been almost nothing done. There's a professor at the Smithsonian, his name is Egan, who has been corresponding with me. He says if I can provide sufficient documentation, he will advocate for publication through the institution's scientific series." She stopped, because she was aware that the thing she had just said carried with it the full weight of the dark past, and the forbidden hope, and the hidden motive that she had been carrying alone for years. And saying it aloud to another person in the middle of a canvas tent in the New Mexico desert felt both exhilarating and frightening. "This is why I'm here. This is what I turned Bernard Ashworth's 14 rooms and his staff of 6 down for. Not the adventure of it, not the romance of the frontier. This, work that is mine, work that matters, work that has my name on it." Martin was very still. Outside the tent, the morning was warming rapidly, the way mornings did in the desert, and she could hear the mine's machinery beginning its daily rhythm in the distance. "And you couldn't have done this from Philadelphia?" He asked, and it was not a challenge. She could hear that. It was a genuine question from someone who was genuinely trying to understand. "I could have tried," she said. "I spent 4 years trying. I did research that was published under Professor Whitmore's name. I attended lectures I wasn't officially allowed to attend. I wrote analysis that went into footnotes. The Institution of Academic Geology in Philadelphia in 1879 was not designed to have my name on anything significant. Here," she swept her hand around the tent, "at the maps and notebooks and specimens, here I am the only geologist. There is no one else to hand the credit to." He nodded slowly, processing this. She watched the processing happen behind his eyes, and felt the familiar anxiety of waiting to see which way someone would fall, the condescension side, or the understanding side. People in Redrock had been largely too practical to waste energy on condescension about what she was doing, but she had not yet fully tested where Martin Dalton stood. He stood on the understanding side. She could see it settle into his expression like a key finding its lock. "The letter from your mother," he said, "that's the trapped feeling." "It is not a feeling," she said carefully. "It would have been an actual trap. Bernard Ashworth is not a bad man. He is simply a man who would have filled every room of his 14-room house with everything I was supposed to want, and I would have lived in it and been perfectly comfortable, and I would have done nothing that was genuinely mine for the rest of my life." "That's a very specific kind of suffering," Martin said, and the tone in his voice was not pitying. It was recognizing. "You know something about it. I know a different version of it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at one of her maps without seeing it exactly, looking through it at something else. "My family back in Texas had a particular vision of what the ranch was supposed to be and what my role in it was supposed to be. I was the eldest son. There was a role. It was a comfortable role in a lot of ways. Good land, good operation, everything laid out." He paused. "I left because a role that someone else wrote for you, even a good role, is a kind of cage if you never got to choose it. How did your family take it?" "Poorly initially. Better eventually. My brother runs the Texas operation now and does a better job of it than I would have." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "There's a freedom in knowing that the thing you left behind is being well cared for by someone who actually wants it." Letitia looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the canvas of the tent in a diffused amber glow that made everything look slightly warmer than it was, which was saying something because the desert was already formidably warm. "Will you help me with something?" she said. "What kind of something?" I want to survey the canyon formation north of your land, the one that follows the dry creek bed for about 4 miles. I've been watching it from a distance for months, but I need to go through it properly, and I've been putting it off because it's a 2-day trip alone, and Sheriff Byatt has asked me not to do any overnight survey trips alone, which I consider a reasonable request given recent events. Recent events being the fact that there had been 2 armed robberies on isolated travelers in the region over the past 3 months, which had introduced a genuine element of physical danger into what were normally merely difficult working conditions. I would pay you for your time, she added quickly. He shook his head slightly. You don't need to pay me. I do. I won't take charity. Then consider it a professional arrangement. I know that country. I know where the water is and where the rock faces are unstable. You provide the geology. I provide the navigation. We split the value of the expedition. He paused. Agreed. Agreed, she said, and something in the exchange felt like the sealing of something considerably larger than an agreement about a canyon survey, though neither of them said so. They left 3 days later, in the last cool hour before dawn. Letitia on the brown mare she had purchased from a rancher on the edge of town 6 months earlier, and Martin on his gray gelding, which was a horse of notable intelligence and remarkable stubbornness, that seemed to have decided it like Letitia, based on some inscrutable equine criterion that Martin could not explain. They carried food for 2 days, water in canteens and a collapsible India rubber container, Letitia's surveying tools in their leather case, the notebooks, and the basic provisions for 2 separate sleeping arrangements that Letitia had been very deliberate about organizing, because she was aware that a single woman and a single man overnight in the wilderness was a situation that could generate a particular kind of social consequence in a town of 300 people. Martin had not commented on the separate arrangements. He had simply helped load them. The canyon they were heading for was known locally as Red Throat Canyon, a name that described it accurately. It was a deep, narrow slash in the red rock landscape, the creek that ran through it for perhaps 6 weeks of the year having carved over thousands of years a passage that felt, standing at its entrance in the early morning, like something the earth had exhaled. The walls rose on either side to a height of 60 or 70 feet in places, and the floor was a mix of water-smoothed sandstone, loose gravel, and in the deeper sections, a dark layer of basalt that indicated volcanic activity from a period so ancient that Letitia felt the number of years like a physical pressure on her chest, something too large for the mind to fully hold. "This is extraordinary," she said, about 20 minutes into the canyon, standing very still and looking at a section of wall where multiple geological periods were visible in distinct horizontal layers, each one a different color: cream, red, dark brown, the dark intrusion of basalt, then cream again above it. "I've ridden through here probably a dozen times," Martin said from behind her. "I never thought much about the walls." "You were thinking about cattle," she said, without looking away from the wall. She pulled her notebook from her satchel and began writing. "Look at this sequence. This dark layer here, this is the Permian probably, 300 million years. And above it this red sandstone, that's more recent, maybe 250 million. And then this layer here," she pointed higher. "This breaks the sequence in a way that suggests significant geological disruption. Something happened here. A fault, perhaps, or a localized volcanic intrusion." He came to stand beside her, closer than they usually stood in town, because the canyon was narrow and the wall demanded close inspection if you were going to actually look at it. She was aware of his proximity in a way that was distinct from professional awareness, which was the kind of awareness she tried not to analyze too carefully while she was working. "The dark layer," he said, "that's volcanic. It was once. 300 million years ago, this was an active volcanic region. The evidence is in the rock." She traced the line of it with her finger, not touching the stone, just indicating. "This is what I mean about the geological record. It's all here." Everything that happened, every convulsion, every transformation, it just requires someone to read it. He looked at the wall for a moment and she watched him as she sometimes found herself doing, noting the quality of his attention, the way he looked at things fully rather than partially. "You read it like a language," he said. "It is a language," she said. "A very slow one. How long does it take to learn?" "I started learning it when I was 11 years old. I found a fossil in the creek behind my grandparents' house in Virginia, a trilobite, which is a marine creature from the Paleozoic era. My grandmother, who was a practical woman with a scientific mind, showed me what it was and explained that we were standing on what had once been the bottom of an ocean. I cried," she added, with a slight note of self-mockery, "from the sheer enormity of it. My grandmother thought I was upset, but I was the opposite of upset. I was overwhelmed by how much more there was than I had understood." Martin turned to look at her. They were in the narrow space of the canyon with the pack horses standing patiently behind them, quite close. "That's a very specific memory to carry for 20 years. I carry it because it was the first time the world felt larger than what the people around me were telling me it was." She looked back at the wall, because the wall was easier to look at than his face at this particular proximity. "I suppose I have been chasing that feeling ever since." They worked the canyon through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping when Letitia needed to sketch or measure or record, Martin holding horses and fetching water, and occasionally pointing out features in the upper sections of the walls that she might have missed because she was focused on the sections she could reach. He had an observational precision that she found consistently useful. He noticed things, cataloged them, and reported them without editorializing, which was the single most useful skill a field assistant could have and which most people did not possess naturally. Around midday, they stopped to eat in a section of the canyon where a wide natural shelf of sandstone created a shaded overhang, and they sat with their backs against the cool stone and ate the dried beef and cornbread Maurice had helped Letitia pack, and drank water from the canteens, and for a while did not say much. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the comfortable silence of two people who had become accustomed to each other's presence, which was itself a kind of intimacy that Letitia was trying not to examine too directly. "Can I ask you something?" Martin said after a while. "You keep asking permission," she said. "You don't need to. Old habit, Texas." He looked at the opposite wall of the canyon where a thin line of dried vegetation marked the last water line. "Do you plan to stay after the survey is published?" "After the work is done." She was quiet for a moment. It was the question she had not asked herself directly, which meant she had been avoiding it, which meant there was something about it that frightened her. "I don't know what done looks like," she said finally. "There's always more to survey. The territory is enormous." She paused. "What is it you're actually asking?" He turned to look at her. The canyon light was diffused and cool in the shade of the overhang, and she could see his face clearly, more clearly perhaps than she usually allowed herself, because in town there were always reasons to look at other things. "I'm asking if Raydrock is a means to an end for you or if it has become something more than that." His voice was measured, which was the way he said most things, but there was something underneath the measurement that was not measured at all. "I'm aware that those are two very different things and that the answer to the question matters." "It matters to whom?" she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. "To me," he said simply. The canyon held the word. The afternoon held it. Letitia sat with the weight of it, feeling the enormity of it the way she had felt the enormity of the trilobite when she was 11 years old, an overwhelming awareness of how much more there was than she had understood. "I came here for the geology," she said carefully. "That is still true, but she stopped and started again. The place has become something to me. The people in it have become something to me." She looked at her hands, at the red dust ground into the creases of her knuckles. "You have become something to me," she said, because she was not a woman who was able to say the smaller thing when she meant the larger one. "I find it difficult to know what to do with that." "Because of the work," he said. "Because of the work, yes. and because I did not come here to repeat the pattern I left behind. I did not leave Bernard Ashworth's 14 rooms in order to walk into some other man's version of what I should want. I wouldn't do that. The certainty in his voice was not the certainty of someone who had never thought about it. It was the certainty of someone who had. How do you know? She said, and it was a genuine question, not a challenge. Because I watched you work this morning for 6 hours, he said, and it was the clearest I have ever seen anyone be about what they were made for. And the only thing I felt watching it was that I didn't want it to stop. He paused. I've been around people who resented other people's clarity. I'm not one of them. I wouldn't know what to do with a woman who dimmed herself down for me. It would just be less. And I'm not interested in less. Letitia looked at him for a long moment. A lizard ran across the sandstone shelf between them and disappeared into a crack in the wall, startlingly quick. That is either the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me, she said, or it is a very sophisticated trap. Something in his eyes glinted, not quite amusement, but close to it. I'm not sophisticated enough for traps. What you see is what's there. That is also something a sophisticated trap would say. Now he did almost smile, the corner of his mouth lifting fractionally. I think you're going to be suspicious of everyone for a very long time. I am suspicious of everyone precisely the right amount, she said. I trust my own observations and I gather data before I draw conclusions. She looked at him, gathering data. I have been gathering data on you for 14 months. And the conclusions are not yet complete, she said. But they are promising. The second day in the canyon was where things became complicated, because that was where they encountered the other party. They were 3 men, and they appeared at the south end of the canyon at approximately mid-morning on the second day, when Letitia and Martin were about 2/3 of the way through the survey of the formation. The men appeared to be prospectors. They had the equipment of prospectors, the mules, the pans, the tools, but there was something about the way they moved and the way they looked at Letitia and Martin that was not quite right. A hardness in the eyes that was not the ordinary hardness of men who worked outdoors. Martin moved very slightly closer to Letitia, not placing himself in front of her, because he knew she would not want that, but adjacent to her, which she recognized as thoughtful. Morning, the lead man said. He was big, with a sunburned neck and a beard that had not been tended recently. You folks surveying. Mining work, Martin said, for the price operation. The man looked at Letitia's tools and notebooks with the particular calculating look of someone adding things up. Long way from the price mine. Geological survey is always preliminary work, Letitia said, because silence would have been more suspicious than speech. We document the formations over a wide area before making recommendations about where to focus the extraction. The man looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating what he had expected to find. Then he looked at Martin with the expression of someone deciding something. There's been talk in Santa Fe, he said, about silver in this formation. You find anything like that? Letitia kept her expression completely neutral, which required the active internal suppression of several different reactions, because there had been indications in her survey data. Nothing confirmed, nothing she was prepared to state as fact, but geological indicators that were consistent with the presence of silver-bearing ore in one specific section of the canyon that they had, as it happened, already passed and documented, and that she had made detailed notes about, and that she was not going to share with 3 men she did not know who had appeared from nowhere, and whose prospecting equipment might or might not be the real reason they were in this canyon. Nothing definitive, she said. The lead man watched her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he glanced at Martin again, and then he tipped his hat and moved on with his mules. When they were out of earshot, Martin said quietly, "You found silver indicators." "I found potential indicators," she said, equally quietly. "Nothing confirmed, but yes." She met his eyes. "I'm not going to give information to strangers in a canyon." That was the right call. He watched the direction the men had gone, his expression attentive and measuring. "We should finish quickly and not camp here tonight. Come back earlier than planned." I was already thinking that. They looked at each other. It was a look of two people who had just navigated a mildly threatening situation together and found that they did it well. Data point, she said. What? For the conclusions, that was a useful data point. She opened her notebook and began writing. You moved close to me without moving in front of me. That was considered. He was quiet for a moment. You noticed. I notice things. It's my primary professional skill. She wrote a measurement in her notebook and underlined it twice. I also noticed that you didn't try to speak for me or answer the question that was directed at me. It was your information to give or not give. Yes, she said, it was. She closed the notebook and looked at him squarely. Martin. Yes. When we get back to Redrock, I would like to have dinner with you. Not a professional consultation. Not an accidental convergence at the same establishment. A deliberate dinner where we talk about things other than geology for a sufficient amount of time to determine whether the conclusions I'm drawing are accurate. She said this in the same direct, precise tone she used to describe sedimentary formations, which was, she was aware, not entirely conventional for this type of proposition. Would that be agreeable to you? That would be very agreeable to me, he said, in a voice from which he had removed almost all expression and which still somehow communicated a great deal. They packed and rode out within the hour, and the three men were nowhere to be seen, and the silver indicators in her notebook were safe in the complicated script she had developed for her more sensitive observations that no one else had ever learned to read. The ride back to Redrock was faster than the ride out, both of them instinctively pushing the pace, and they talked as they rode, not about the men in the canyon, which they had agreed implicitly to address when they were safely back, but about other things, easy and quick-moving things, the conversation flowing between topics with the naturalness of two people discovering that they fit each other's minds in a way that kept surprising them both. She learned that he had read more than she expected, not academic texts, but novels, histories, the kind of books that reached toward the larger questions of what people were, and why they did what they did. He learned that she had a specific and detailed knowledge of the history of the telescope, which was not what he expected, and which was, he said, one of the stranger and more compelling things he had ever discovered about another person. She told him about the night she had snuck out of her parents' house in Philadelphia at the age of 18 to attend a lecture on celestial mechanics at a hall that did not admit women, and had sat in the back with her hair tucked up and her face half covered by her winter scarf, and had understood perhaps 60% of the mathematics, but had been so overwhelmed by the beauty of the ideas that she had cried silently into her scarf for the last 20 minutes of the presentation. He listened to this without the expression of someone who found it eccentric. He listened with the expression of someone who was filling in details of a picture he had been trying to see clearly for a long time. Back in Redrock, they reported the encounter with the three men to Sheriff Bayed, who listened with the focused attention of someone who had been tracking the robbery reports and was now organizing a new piece of evidence into a developing picture. He thanked them and asked them to stay in town for the next few days, which they both agreed to, and then Letitia went back to her room at Al Maurice's boarding house and cleaned the canyon dust from her hands and her face, and sat at the small desk she had placed beneath the window and looked at her notebooks. The silver indicators were real. She needed more documentation before she could say it conclusively, but the signs were there, the characteristic mineralization of the surrounding rock, the particular veining pattern in the dark basalt layer, the composition of the sediment in the canyon floor. If she was right, and she believed she was, Red Throat Canyon contained a silver deposit of potentially significant size, which meant that Hector Price needed to know about it, which meant she needed to file a proper survey report, which meant the three men in the canyon may have been prospectors with better intelligence than she had given them credit for, or they may have been something more troubling, someone else's scouts, looking for confirmation of something that someone else already suspected. She wrote 3 letters that evening, one to Professor Egan at the Smithsonian, updating him on the geological survey progress. One to Hector Price, requesting an urgent meeting. One to her mother in Philadelphia, which was the shortest and in some ways the most difficult. In the letter to her mother, she wrote that she was well and that she was working, and that the work was genuinely her own, and that she had not made a mistake, and that she hoped, in time, to produce something that would make the reasons for her choices legible in a way that she had not yet been able to make them in person. She did not mention Bernard Ashworth, except to say that she was certain the arrangement would be more satisfying for everyone if he found someone who actually wanted what he was offering. She did not mention Martin Dalton, because she did not yet know what she would say about Martin Dalton that would be accurate and complete. The dinner happened 3 days later, when the immediate tension around the canyon encounter had subsided to a background concern rather than a foreground one, when Sheriff Byatt had identified 2 of the 3 men as associates of a land speculation operation out of Albuquerque that had been attempting to locate and stake mining claims ahead of the official survey process, which was illegal and which Byatt was handling through the appropriate channels. The dinner was at the establishment run by a man named Gideon Cole, who had come from New Orleans, and who cooked with a complexity and attention that consistently surprised people who expected frontier food to be purely functional. It was the closest thing Redrock had to a restaurant, and on a Tuesday evening it was quiet enough to have a real conversation without having to raise your voice over the ambient noise of the place. Letitia wore a dress she had not worn since arriving in Redrock, a gray-blue wool chally that she had brought from Philadelphia in a moment of sentiment, and which had spent 14 months folded in the bottom of her trunk. She had not brought it because she expected to wear it. She had brought it because it was beautiful, and she had not been able to leave it behind entirely, which was the particular illogic of packing for a life change. She wore her hair up in a less practical and more deliberate arrangement than the one she used for field work, and when she walked into Gideon Cole's establishment, and Martin Dalton stood up from the table where he had been waiting, the expression that crossed his face was brief and quickly controlled, but she caught it, and she filed it carefully in the conclusions that were developing. He had dressed with a care that was apparent in the way the shirt was clean, and the jacket was the good one rather than the working one, and he had shaved recently, probably that afternoon, and she found herself moved by the effort in a way that she had not entirely anticipated, the way that people were sometimes moved by small gestures that cost something real. "You look beautiful," he said, and then appeared to check whether he should have said it, and she answered the unasked question by sitting down and saying, "Thank you. You look considerably cleaner than you did 3 days ago." He laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh with full release rather than the controlled near-smile version, and it was a good laugh, genuine and unguarded, and it did something to the atmosphere at the table. They talked for 2 hours. They talked about Texas and Philadelphia and what it felt like to leave the place you came from, about the particular quality of freedom that territory gives you when you earn your own ground, about what they each wanted when they looked 20 years forward. Martin told her about his plans for the land, not grandiose plans, but careful ones, the plans of someone who thought in terms of what was actually sustainable rather than what looked impressive. He wanted to expand the cattle operation by 1/3, selectively, not beyond what the land could support. He wanted to improve the water situation, which meant engineering a small reservoir in a section of the property where the natural topography would support it. He wanted, eventually, to have children, though he said this with the care of someone who understood that it was a thing that required another person's agreement and not just one person's desire. She told him about the Smithsonian survey and what it would mean for the territory, a documented geological record that would make future land use decisions, mining operations, water management possible to do with actual intelligence rather than guesswork. She told him that she wanted it published not just under her own name but as a contribution to a broader body of knowledge that would outlast her, and his eyes on her face while she said this were the eyes of someone who understood exactly what she meant. "The silver deposit," he said at some point in the evening. "When you report it to Price, what happens?" "He files a claim. The mine expands. There may be significant investment." She turned her water glass slowly on the table. "It will change Redrock, most likely. Significant silver operations change towns." She looked at him. "Is that a problem for you?" "Growth changes things," he said, "not always for the worse. The cattle operation benefits from a larger population in some ways. The land management gets more complicated in others." He paused. "What happens to your survey work if the mine expands?" She had been thinking about this. "The geological documentation becomes more important, not less. Expansion without understanding the formation is how you destroy a deposit prematurely." She met his eyes. "I would want to be involved as the documented expert on this formation, not as an employee of the mine but as an independent surveyor under contract." "Have you proposed that to Price?" "Not yet, but I will." She lifted her chin slightly, which was a gesture he had learned meant she was preparing for potential resistance. "It's the logical arrangement." "I agree. I also think he'll see it that way once he understands the value of what you have." He paused. "Hector Price is not a complicated man. He responds to demonstrated value. You have demonstrated it comprehensively." "Your endorsement would help," she said, and the slight stiffness in her voice when she said it acknowledged that she was asking for something and did not entirely like asking for it. "You have it," he said simply, "whatever it's worth." "It's worth something in this town," she said. "You've been here 5 years, you're known. And you've been here 14 months and you're known too, in a different way." He looked at her directly. "The way people talk about you in Redrock, Letitia." He stopped, and she noticed with a small internal adjustment that it was the first time he had used her first name, her actual name, without the formality of the last name attached. "They talk about you the way they talk about something they're proud of, like a thing that makes the place more than it was." She looked at him for a long moment, and she felt the enormous weight of that, the unexpected weight of being seen clearly by a community she had not expected to feel claimed by. "I wasn't looking for that," she said softly. "I know. That's generally how it happens." He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, briefly, a light press of warm fingers on her hand, and then withdrew it. "I wasn't looking for you either. It seems to have been irrelevant." 2 months after the dinner at Gideon Cole's, Professor Egan's response arrived from the Smithsonian, and it was better than anything Letitia had dared to calculate for. He wrote that the survey documentation she had provided was the most thorough geological record of the New Mexico Territory's Red Rock region that the institution had received, that the silver indicators she had documented and the subsequent official confirmation from the mining operation were themselves of significant scientific interest, and that he was prepared to recommend her work for publication in the institution's geological series, under her own name, as lead author, with his team providing editorial support. He asked her to come to Washington to finalize the arrangement. She read the letter 4 times. Then she sat very still at her desk for approximately 10 minutes, during which her mind made a circuit of every decision, every sacrifice, every difficult morning and dusty afternoon and letter from her mother and social judgment absorbed, and smile forced and footnote accepted that had been the price of arriving at this letter. The price had been real, and the letter made it real in a different direction. She told Martin first, before she told anyone else, and she was not entirely certain what that fact signified, but she noted it. She found him in the morning at the south section of his land where he was working on the fencing that bordered the creek bed, and she rode up on the brown mare and he turned when he heard the hoofbeats, and she held up the letter and he came to the fence and she handed it to him and watched his face as he read it. "Smithsonian publication," he said. "Lead author." "Yes." He handed the letter back. He was looking at her with an expression she had learned to read over 2 months of dinners and long mornings in survey tents, and one significant kissing incident behind the post office that neither of them had mentioned since, but that both of them had been thinking about steadily. The expression said that he was happy for her in a way that was completely genuine and that had nothing performing in it. "You did it," he said. "I haven't gone to Washington yet. There are details to finalize." "The details are formalities. You did the work. This is what the work earned." He stepped over the fence, which he could do in a single long stride, and stood in front of her while she was still mounted on the mare, which meant she was above him and looking down at his face, and he was looking up at her, and the morning sun was at his back and she could see everything in his face that he was allowing her to see, which was more than she expected, and which was everything she needed. "I am proud of you," he said, and the simplicity of it made her eyes sting with something she was not going to allow to become weeping, because she had never been a woman who wept in public, and she was not starting now on the back of a horse in front of a fence. "Thank you," she said, in a voice that was steady because she made it steady. "How long will you be in Washington?" 2 weeks, perhaps 3. She looked at him carefully. "I will come back." "I know you will." He said it without doubt, and she filed that confidence in the conclusions as well. "When do you leave?" "I need to arrange the journey. Stage to Santa Fe, then the train from there, probably 10 days from now." She looked at him with the directness she always used, the directness that some people found uncomfortable, and that he had never found anything other than honest. "I want to write to you while I am there. If that is acceptable." "It's more than acceptable," he said, and the thing that passed across his face briefly was something she thought might be relief, as though he had been holding a question he had not been certain how to ask, and the question had just been answered for him. She went to Washington in September of 1883. The train journey from Santa Fe was 2 days, and she sat by the window for most of it and watched the landscape change from the red rock and scrubland of New Mexico to the grasslands of Kansas, to the woodlands of Missouri and Ohio and Pennsylvania, and felt the passage of landscapes as a physical sensation, each one distinct, each one with its own geological story written in the soil and stone. When she arrived in Washington, D.C., and stepped out of the train station into the city's particular organized noise and the smell of coal smoke and cobblestones, she felt the strangeness of it, the too closeness of it, the sense of a world pressing in from all sides that she had forgotten was possible to feel. She met Professor Egan at the Smithsonian, and he was a precise, enthusiastic man of about 50 with wire-rimmed spectacles and the slightly abstracted manner of someone who spent most of his time thinking about geological time scales. And their professional meeting lasted 4 hours and covered the complete survey documentation and the publication structure, and the specific contribution that her silver deposit documentation would make to the current debate in the geological community about volcanic-related silver ore formation in the Western Territories. He treated her with the complete professional respect of one expert addressing another, and she found that she had to take several careful breaths to fully receive this, because the alternative was the completely professional tears that she absolutely was not going to have in the Smithsonian Institution. She also met, quite unexpectedly, at a dinner hosted by Professor Egan on her second evening in Washington, a woman named Dr. Helena Cross, who was the first woman she had ever met who held an actual doctoral degree in the natural sciences, awarded by the University of Zurich, which had been admitting women to doctoral programs since 1867, in a way that American universities had not yet figured out they should do. Dr. Cross was 43 years old and formidably intelligent, and looked at Letitia's survey documentation with a focused, hungry attention that Letitia recognized immediately as the look of one scientist recognizing the work of another. "You need to come back here," Dr. Cross said, setting down the documentation with the finality of someone announcing a decision. "The institution needs people like you." I have been advocating for a dedicated geological survey of the Western Territories for 3 years, and what you have produced independently in 14 months is better than anything a commissioned survey has managed." Letitia was quiet for a moment. "I'm not certain I want to be here," she said, which was the most honest response and the one most likely to be complicated. Dr. Cross raised an eyebrow. "The territory, New Mexico, the work, the land," she paused. "The life I have built there." She said this with the full awareness that the life she had built included Martin Dalton in a way that was becoming increasingly central and increasingly impossible to consider abstractly. Dr. Cross looked at her with the particular kind of understanding that comes from being a woman who has navigated the intersection of professional ambition and personal reality in a world that was not designed to accommodate both. "The two things are not mutually exclusive," she said. "I know," Letitia said. "I am still working out what the combination looks like." She wrote to Martin twice a week from Washington, and his replies came back with the kind of care and attention she had hoped for, not long letters, because he was not a man of many words on paper, but precise ones, with observations about the land and the cattle and the odd social dynamics of a small town in the territory, and one specific letter in which he described riding through Red Throat Canyon at dusk, and looking at the walls the way she had shown him to look at them, reading the layers, and said that he could not do it without thinking of her, which was not something he had intended to admit, but which appeared to have come out anyway. She read that particular letter sitting in the small room she was renting on Pennsylvania Avenue, and felt something clear and definite settle in her chest, the way a measurement settled into a survey record when all the numbers confirmed each other. She came back to Rock in October, on the southbound stage from Santa Fe, on a morning that was cool and clear, the desert landscape vivid in the autumn light that hit the red formations differently than summer light, lower and more angled, making the colors more saturated. She had been gone 5 weeks, which was a week longer than planned because the publication process had required more discussion than estimated, and the extra week had been both productive professionally and distinctly uncomfortable personally. Martin was at the stage stop when she arrived. He had not told her he would be there, and she had not told him when exactly she would arrive, but he was there, with the gray gelding and the brown mare on a lead, because he had apparently come to meet the stage every day for the past 3 days on the chance that it would be the day she came back, which she learned from Alma Reese later, and which she filed in the conclusions without comment, because the conclusions did not need any more confirmation, but she was glad of it anyway. He helped her with the trunk, which she did not need help with but which she did not refuse, and they walked the horses back toward town in the cool October morning, and she told him about the Smithsonian and Professor Egan and Dr. Helena Cross, and the publication timeline, and the subsequent work it would open up, and he listened with the full attention. He always gave things that mattered to her, and she felt the relief of being home, which was a word she had not fully applied to Rock before but which appeared to be accurate. "There is something I need to tell you," she said as they walked, "about Dr. Cross's proposal." He waited. "She has advocated for a formal contract between the Smithsonian Institution and an independent geological surveyor to document the Western Territories on an ongoing basis. She wants me to be that surveyor. It would be a 5-year initial contract, with a substantial annual payment, full publication rights, and institutional support." She looked at him. "The contract would require me to continue living and working in the territory. It would not require me to be in Washington." He was quiet for a step, 2 steps. "That's everything you wanted. More than I wanted. I had not calculated for institutional backing." She kept her voice professionally level, which was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of his expression, which was doing something complicated and warm. "It means I am staying, definitively." She paused. "It also means I am not simply the mine surveyor anymore. I would be operating independently with institutional resources. It changes my position here." "For the better," he said. "In professional terms, yes. In social terms, it may be more complicated." A woman with an institutional contract and published scientific work is not, she stopped. Not the expected kind of woman, he said. Not the expected kind of anything. She looked at him sideways. I want to be certain that you understand what you are, that is to say, what I am. She stopped again because the sentence was not coming out the way she intended. Martin, Letitia, I am asking whether the particularity of who I am presents a genuine difficulty for you, not theoretically, practically. In terms of, she made a brief, frustrated gesture with the hand that was not holding the mare's lead. I am not someone who is going to become smaller for anyone. I tried that for years and it did not take. You deserve to know that clearly before what? His voice was very quiet. Before I allow this to become what it appears to be becoming, she said, in a voice that was almost but not quite steady. Because if it becomes what it appears to be becoming, I need to know that you will not, 6 months from now or 6 years from now, decide that what you wanted was something more like what Bernard Ashworth wanted, something comfortable and arranged and quiet. Martin stopped walking. She stopped too, because he had, and the horses stopped, and the October morning held them all still. I've been thinking, he said, about what to say to you since approximately the 3rd week you were in Washington. He looked at her with the direct, undeflecting attention that she had come to recognize as his deepest mode, the mode he reserved for things that actually mattered to him. I don't want comfortable and quiet. I want you. The work, the notebooks, the rock formations, the arguments about measurements, the coming home with red dust in your hair, the letters from the Smithsonian, all of it. He paused. I want to build the reservoir on my land and have you tell me whether the geology will support it. I want to read your published survey and understand it, because you've been teaching me to read it. I want to have dinner with you at Gideon Cole's every week and talk about everything until the candles burn down. He paused again. I want to have children with you who will grow up knowing that their mother's name is on a published Smithsonian survey, which is a thing I think a child should know. Letitia stood very still. The brown mare turned to look at her, as horses sometimes did when their riders became suddenly motionless. That was a great many things, she said finally. It was. Was there a proposal in there somewhere? There was. He looked at her steadily. Yes or no are both acceptable. She looked at him for a long moment, the geologist in her cataloging everything, the quality of his certainty, the absence of performance in it, the specific texture of his attention, 14 months of accumulated data points, the letter about riding through Red Throat Canyon, and not being able to stop thinking about her. All of it pointing in one direction with the comfortable clarity of a survey that had come back exactly right. Yes, she said. Obviously yes. Something in his face unlocked in a way she had never seen before, a fullness of expression that his usual reserve had kept carefully measured, and he stepped forward and kissed her in the October morning on the road outside of Riedrock, both of them still holding the leads of patient, stoic horses. And it was not like the kissing incident behind the post office, which had been brief and somewhat startling, but like something that had been waiting a long time for space to become itself. They were married in December of 1883, in the small church at the edge of Riedrock, in a ceremony that was simple by design because Letitia had told the pastor that she wanted something honest rather than something elaborate, and the pastor, who had come to appreciate Letitia Bell's particular form of directness over 14 months of Sunday encounters, had understood perfectly. Alma Reese wore her best dress and cried in a dignified manner. Hector Price, who had by now fully recovered from whatever initial doubts he had harbored about female geologists, attended and shook Martin's hand with the solemnity of a man who considered himself partly responsible for the whole business by virtue of having hired Letitia in the first place. Sheriff Byard was there, and Clara Marsh the schoolteacher, and the Montoya family who ran the livery stable and who brought food to the reception that was substantially better than anything else being served. Her mother wrote a letter that arrived in January, 6 weeks after the ceremony, because news traveled slowly and Letitia had written to inform her, and the letter from Philadelphia was several pages long and covered the terrain from disappointment through reluctant acknowledgement through something that was not quite approval, but was closer to it than Letitia had expected. Her mother mentioned the Smithsonian contract with a complicated mixture of pride and confusion, as though she could not quite decide which category it belonged to, but was giving it tentative credit. She mentioned Martin Dalton with cautious hope, having established from Letitia's description that he was a man of property and demonstrable character, if not of Boston money or 14 rooms. She did not mention Bernard Ashworth, which was the most gracious thing she could have done. Martin's family in Texas wrote with warmth, and his brother wrote specifically to say that he expected them to visit when the season allowed, and that whoever had managed to get Martin to stop being stubborn about things that mattered deserved a proper welcome. The Smithsonian survey contract was formally signed in February of 1884, and Letitia Dalton, born Letitia Bell, became the first independently contracted female geological surveyor in the institution's history, which was a fact that Professor Egan noted in his correspondence as if it were a thing that had simply happened through the natural progress of science, and which Dr. Helena Cross noted in her correspondence as a thing that had happened through particular determination and excellent timing, and a willingness to go somewhere nobody else was willing to go and do the work. In the spring of 1884, Martin's reservoir project was completed, engineered with the benefit of Letitia's geological assessment of the bedrock formation that determined the optimal placement and depth, and it changed the water situation on his land enough to make the expansion he had planned genuinely feasible. They celebrated with dinner at Gideon Cole's and walked home in the spring dark under a sky that was extravagantly populated with stars, the way the desert sky was when there was no moisture to obscure it. And she told him which constellations were which, and he listened, and she was aware, walking through the dark with his hand warm around hers, that this was the largest version of herself she had ever been, and that the largest version of herself had not required anything to be smaller. Their son was born in December of 1884, a strong and vocal boy with Martin's dark hair and Letitia's relentless determination to look directly at whatever was in front of him. They named him Thomas, after Martin's father, which was a thing Martin had not asked for, and which Letitia had offered because she understood that the Texas past was complicated, and that offering something uncomplicated toward it was a form of love. Thomas Dalton arrived in the world during a cold snap that sent the temperature below freezing for 4 consecutive days, and Alma Reese served as the attending woman because Reedrock's doctor had been delayed by the same weather, and Alma was calm and capable and absolutely not frightened of anything, which was exactly what was needed. Martin held his son for the first time in the lamplight of the room they had made for each other in the house he had built on his land, a house that Letitia had had significant opinions about the design of, and his face in that moment was something she kept filed, alongside every other important observation she had ever made, a record of something true. The Geological Survey publication was released by the Smithsonian Institution in March of 1885, under the title Geological Survey of the Central Red Rock Region, New Mexico Territory, authored by Letitia Dalton, with acknowledgments to Professor Egan, Dr. Cross, and the staff of the Price mining operation. It was approximately 300 pages of maps, analysis, specimen documentation, and formation records, and it was the most comprehensive document of its kind for the region, and it was reviewed favorably in 3 scientific journals, including one in England, and it established its author as a recognized authority on the geology of the Southwestern Territories. Hector Price bought 6 copies and put one in a place of prominence in his office, which was his way of expressing something he did not have words for. Martin read it in full, which took him 3 weeks because he read carefully and stopped to look things up when he encountered terminology he did not have, and when he was finished, He told Letitia that he now understood the red rock formations around their land differently than he had before, and that this felt like an upgrade to his entire understanding of where he was, and that it was the best thing he had ever read, which was not entirely objective, but which she received with the full warmth it deserved. The town of Redrock grew over the following years, as the silver deposit confirmed by Letitia's preliminary findings generated investment and new operations, and the population increased from 300 to nearly 900 by 1888. The growth brought complications, more people, more competing interests, the particular friction of a place becoming something different from what it had been. But it also brought a doctor, a larger school, and a telegraph office, which connected Redrock to a larger world, and which Letitia used to maintain her correspondence with the Smithsonian with greater efficiency than the unreliable mail had allowed. She surveyed two more significant formations in those years, both of which added to the Smithsonian record, and one of which, a canyon system 30 miles to the east, contained evidence of a paleontological significance that she identified as being outside her primary expertise, and which she reported to the institution with the recommendation that a paleontologist be sent to investigate. The paleontologist who eventually arrived in the fall of 1887 was a young man from Yale named Prescott, who was brilliantly educated and utterly unprepared for the actual conditions of field work in the desert, and Letitia spent 3 weeks orienting him in the most patient and efficient manner she could manage, which Martin found quietly hilarious, and which she refused to find anything other than a professional obligation. Their second child, a daughter they named Eleanor after Letitia's grandmother, who had shown her the trilobite in the creek in Virginia, arrived in the spring of 1887. Eleanor was a quieter child than Thomas, but equally observant, and by the time she was old enough to walk steadily, she had developed the habit of picking up interesting rocks and bringing them to her mother for identification, which Letitia addressed with seriousness and precision regardless of whether the rock was genuinely interesting or simply an ordinary piece of sandstone. The letter from her mother that arrived in the summer of 1887 was different from any previous letter, and Letitia recognized this immediately from the handwriting, which was slightly less controlled than usual, as her mother's handwriting became when she was moved by something she had not anticipated. The letter said that she had read the Smithsonian survey. A colleague of her father's had obtained a copy from a scientific society in Boston, and that it was extraordinary, that she had not known what to expect, but that what she found was work of genuine significance, serious and precise, and that she was, the word was crossed out once and rewritten, proud. She was proud, and she was sorry that it had taken her so long to understand what Letitia had been trying to tell her. Letitia read the letter at her desk in the house on the ranch, in the late afternoon when Thomas was asleep, and Eleanor was sitting on the floor beside her pulling yarn from a basket with focused satisfaction, and she sat with the letter for a long time. Some of the things she had been carrying for years were lighter after reading it, and some remained what they were, because the past was the past and understanding it differently did not remake it. But the letter mattered. She wrote back the same day, a longer reply than usual, and included a detailed account of Eleanor's rock collection, and invited her mother to come to New Mexico, which was an invitation that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago and which now felt like the right thing. Her mother came in the spring of 1888 and stayed for 3 weeks, and was clearly overwhelmed by the landscape and the dust and the radical informality of life in the territory. But she held Eleanor with the careful attention of a woman reclaiming something, and she looked at Martin Dalton across the dinner table with the expression of someone revising a previous assessment to a favorable one. And she walked with Letitia one morning out to a section of exposed formation near the ranch, where the layering was particularly dramatic, and listened while Letitia explained what she was looking at. And at the end of the explanation she was quiet for a moment and then said, "You are exactly what you Were always going to be. I simply couldn't see it. It was the most meaningful thing her mother had ever said to her, and Letitia said, "I know, it's all right," and meant it entirely. Thomas grew into a child who combined his father's practical precision with his mother's relentless curiosity about how things worked. And by the age of 6, he had a notebook of his own in which he recorded observations about the ranch and its land, and the cattle and the birds he saw in the canyon east of the house, in a form that resembled his mother's field notebooks enough to make Martin smile in the particular private way he had that meant something had moved him. Eleanor was different. She was a girl who moved through the world on instinct rather than analysis, who felt things with an intensity that sometimes frightened the people around her, and that Letitia recognized from somewhere old and deep in her own history, the part of her that had cried at a trilobite at 11 years old from the sheer, overwhelming weight of understanding that the world was larger than she had known. She held Eleanor's intensity carefully, the way you hold something that you want to grow into what it is rather than what it would be more convenient for it to be. Martin and Letitia fought sometimes, because they were two people with strong and independent minds sharing a life in conditions that were often difficult, and because there were moments when the pull of institutional recognition drew Letitia toward decisions that required more travel than either of them was comfortable with, and moments when the demands of the ranch in a bad season pulled Martin into an exhaustion that made him less patient and more guarded than his best self. They fought with the honesty they had established from the beginning, which meant the fights went to the real thing quickly rather than circling around it, and they resolved in a way that left the foundation intact and occasionally stronger for having been tested. There was a conversation in the difficult summer of 1889, when a drought had hit the cattle operation badly, and Letitia was being asked by the Smithsonian to extend her contract and travel to Arizona Territory for a 3-month survey of a new formation, in which both of them said things that were true and painful, and that cost something to say. She said that she sometimes felt the pull of the work so strongly that it frightened her, the fear that she could be consumed by it, that the hunger of it was the same hunger it had always been, and that it did not diminish with satisfaction the way normal hungers did. He said that he sometimes lay awake in bad seasons trying to determine whether the life they had built was a good enough life for her, whether the territory and the ranch and the small town were genuinely what she wanted, or whether she was making a sustained and gradually depleting sacrifice, and that the thought of her depleting herself for a life she had chosen under duress was a thought he could not make peace with. "I am not depleting myself," she said, and her voice carried the conviction of someone who had made an internal measurement and was reporting it accurately. "I have never been more fully what I am." She paused. "The work and this," she gestured between them, "are not in competition. They are the same thing. They are both the result of choosing the life I actually wanted rather than the life I was handed." He looked at her in the dark in the bedroom of the house they had built together, with the sound of the desert and the distant ranch sounds filtering through the open window. "I needed to hear that," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll tell you as many times as you need." She went to Arizona for the survey. She wrote 3 times a week detailed letters that were half professional observation and half the particular intimacy of 2 people who had learned each other's interior landscape well enough to navigate it in writing. He wrote back every time, shorter letters but dense with the details of the ranch and the children, and the one occasion when Thomas attempted to explain to the new ranch hand exactly why the creek bed on the east section was geologically significant and used approximately 40% of the correct terminology. She came back from Arizona in September with notebooks full of documentation and a discovery she had not expected, a formation that was consistent with the presence of copper ore, which was a finding of significant economic potential in a territory that was still being mapped and understood. She also came back with the clearest version of herself she had ever possessed, the version that had gone 3 months in difficult conditions and produced important work, and missed her family with a steady and complete ache that was not conflict but confirmation. Thomas was 7, and Alina was almost 3 when she came back, and Thomas ran toward her with the full velocity of a child who had decided that velocity was the appropriate response to this reunion. And she caught him and held him and felt the weight of him, how much he had grown in 3 months, and over his shoulder she saw Martin walking toward her with Alina on his hip. And the expression on his face was the expression she had seen in canyon light and morning sun and lamplight, and across a dinner table and in the dark. And it was the same every time, the expression of someone who had found the exact thing they did not know they were looking for and had the sense to recognize it. The Smithsonian Institution published her Arizona Copper Formation Survey in 1890, and her accumulated body of work by that point represented the most comprehensive independent geological survey of the southwestern territories that the institution held. Dr. Helena Cross, who had been advocating for Letitia's full professional recognition for 7 years, wrote to say that there was a discussion among the institution's leadership about creating a named position, a formal role for a territory geological consultant that would be Letitia's by design, which would come with increased institutional support and the permanent archiving of all her survey work. She wrote back to say that she was interested, with the condition that the position allowed her to remain field-based in New Mexico territory, and Dr. Cross wrote back to say that this had been assumed, because everyone involved was aware that the value of the work depended on the surveyor remaining where the geology was. The named position was formalized in 1891, and the document that announced it was framed and hung in the study of the ranch house, in the room that had been built with a desk and shelves for Letitia's notebooks and specimens, and where her work existed in the same house as Martin's ranch records and Thomas's drawing books and Alina's increasingly ambitious rock collection. By the spring of 1892, Raydrock had grown again, to nearly 1,200 people, and the town had a proper newspaper now, and the newspaper ran a piece about Letitia's geological work that was the first time her name appeared in print, in the context of the life she had actually lived, which was distinct from the previous occasions when her name had appeared in print in Boston's social correspondence. She cut out the article and sent it to her mother, who wrote back that she had shown it to everyone she knew, which was the most perfectly accurate summary of who her mother was, and Letitia received it as affection. Thomas at 10 had decided that he wanted to be a civil engineer, a decision that his parents received with equal enthusiasm. Martin because he understood the practical power of infrastructure, and Letitia because she understood that a child who wanted to build things that worked was a child who had inherited something useful from both sides. Alina at 8 had not decided anything yet, but collected rocks and drew very detailed pictures of horses, and was passionately interested in why the stars moved the way they did. And Letitia spent several evenings in the summer sitting with her in the yard of the ranch house, explaining what she knew about celestial mechanics from the lecture she had attended at 18 with her hair tucked up and her face behind her scarf, and feeling the full circle of it, the full completion. The way certain geological formations returned over millions of years to something that resembled their origin in a transformed and completed state. In the autumn of 1892, Martin and Letitia rode out to Red Throat Canyon together for the first time since the survey trip nearly 10 years before. They went alone, the children at home with Alma Reese, who was in her 70s now and sharp as ever, and who had opinions about the children's education that Letitia found challenging and correct in equal measure. They rode in the early morning, the way they had the first time, in the last cool hour before the sun established itself, and the canyon received them in the same ancient silence it had always maintained. She showed him the basalt layer again, the one she had explained to him the first time, and he stood beside it and looked at it with the knowledge she had given him over 10 years, the accumulated language of the rock, and she watched him read it slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, and felt the same thing she had felt the first time she watched him look at something fully and take it seriously. 300 million years, he said. Approximately. And we've been standing here together for nearly 10. He turned to look at her, and in the canyon light his eyes were the same shifting gray-green they had always been, the color of creek water in shadow. It's not the same scale. No, she said, but it is the same principle, pressure and time and what survives them. She looked at the layer and then at him. I think we qualify. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face, a gesture so familiar after nearly 10 years that it was its own kind of language, and she leaned into his hand briefly, a small and complete thing. I am glad you turned him down, he said. Bernard Ashworth. All of it. The 14 rooms, the arranged life. He held her gaze. I know what you sacrificed to get here. I know it was not easy and that parts of it were genuinely painful. But I am profoundly glad that you chose the harder thing, because the harder thing led here. He paused, and here is everything I have. Letitia looked at him in the canyon that she had surveyed a decade ago, in the light that fell the same way it always fell at this hour, illuminating the story written in the stone walls by 300 million years of pressure and transformation and survival. The hawk was above them again, or a hawk like the hawk, riding the thermals in no apparent hurry about anything at all. I told you I would show you, she said. Why I did it. You did. He smiled, the full version, the one she had earned the right to see. I'm still being shown. I think that's the point. She thought about the letter from her mother 3 years ago, the word crossed out and rewritten. She thought about Thomas running toward her with full velocity and Aliner's rock collection, and the Smithsonian's named position, and the publication on the shelf. She thought about dinner at Gideon Cole's and the October morning on the road from the stage stop, and the canyon and the notebooks, and every morning she had woken up in the territory, and known that she was exactly where she was supposed to be doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. She thought about what it meant to be a woman who had refused a comfortable trap and walked into the hardest version of her own life and found, waiting in the difficulty of it, not just the work she had always wanted, but a man who saw her clearly and entirely and was glad of what he saw. It was always going to be here, she said. I just had to get here first. He took her hand, the way he had across the dinner table years ago, but without withdrawing it this time, and they stood together in Red Throat Canyon with the geological history of 300 million years written in the walls around them and the present moment bright and complete in the desert air. And the hawk above them circled one more time and then caught a stronger thermal and rose, and kept rising, until it was a small dark point against the immense sky, unhurried and free. They rode home in the afternoon, in the warmth of an autumn day in New Mexico territory, and Thomas met them at the gate of the ranch with a notebook of his own observations about the dry creek bed. And Aliner was sitting on the porch steps with a significant new rock she needed identified immediately. And Letitia got down from the brown mare and crouched in the dust beside her daughter and took the rock in her hands and looked at it with complete professional attention, and told Aliner exactly what it was and what it meant and where it had come from and how long ago. And Aliner listened with her whole self, the way certain children listened, the way certain children always would, drawn toward the larger world by the knowledge that it was vastly more than anyone had told them yet. Martin stood at the gate of his ranch, watching his family in the autumn light, and felt the fullness of everything that had survived the pressure of being chosen freely and honestly and without reservation, and was glad. And Letitia Bell, who had become Letitia Dalton without becoming anyone other than herself, looked up from the rock in her hands to find him watching, and smiled with the full and unhurried warmth of someone who had built the life she actually wanted, stone by patient stone, and found it holding.